Well, greetings. It's Dr. Blevins again, and I thought I would go ahead and just make a video tonight, capture the time, talking about sort of a kind of key component for you to be thinking about as we move forward, particularly as we've exited out of Ideate and we've already talked about a pitch, something that you really are trying to get other people to hear you well, and hopefully they can ask more. And thinking about the pitch already leads you into sort of marketing. And so this presentation, though I'm tying it here specifically with the pitch in mind, I've actually given um, previously at one of an organization here in Kansas City called the Global Entrepreneurship Week in Kansas City. It's a major gathering around marketing, and so that's how I kind of began to sort of communicate this. I will also say, for some of you who've had my class on Christian spirituality and virtue formation, some of this material may feel a little bit consistent with that course as well. But for others, no, you don't have to go and take the class before you hear this presentation. So let's go back to two major themes that we have been working in Ideate over the last couple of weeks. The first one is really thinking about your personal values. You know, what and why do you want to personally invest in a particular venture? And then ask the question, so, what is your elevator speech? How is it that you are talking about the unique value that your venture brings in such a way that you're hoping the hearer will invest? And I don't mean necessarily give you money, but become an ally and a partner. And so, how do you bring what you're personally, your personal heart is committed to, and the best value that you hope your venture is going to communicate simultaneously? And really, how we understand those two to go together makes a big difference. Partially because we often communicate not merely the value of our venture, but we are communicating also our personal values, our heart, as we begin to talk to others about the venture that we're putting together for this class. Now, is it always just money that people are interested in? As a matter of fact, when you read a lot of entrepreneurship work and economic theory, you'll run into Adam Smith. And probably Adam Smith is probably most famous for his idea that most people are rational decision makers, that when all things are equal, will rationally choose for their own benefit. That's his theory in a nutshell. And that as people rationally choose for their own benefit, particularly their own economic well-being, then that as each people exchange money for goods and services over time, the whole economy is raised as a result of it. He used to call that the famous hidden hand that sometimes people will talk about, that just basically as people work for their own enlightened self-interest, inevitably it helps everyone. And that's kind of in a nutshell, one kind of underlying premise of capitalism. But is that true? I mean, is money the only thing people are invested in when they think about their benefit? And are all decisions based on the rational self-interest? I mean, did Smith have that right? Well, I have a tendency to quibble with that. I mean, I do believe sustainability is important, not just and I don't mean just that we're living with a reasonable income, because I think all of us know, particularly in the United States and in the Western economy, what is sustainable for us is radically different in our own mindset compared to the rest of the majority world. But is that, even in our own context, is it just that, I'll feel better, make more money? Is that what it's all about? Or is there something else at work that really is important in how we are moved, if you will? Is the vision of the venture as important in how we in communicating what's really crucial as the marketing scheme? So making sure our values are heard is what I'm kind of pushed at. And if that is true, and I would say in a course like this one, where ministerial entrepreneurship, this vision of entrepreneurship with ministry in mind, many times we'll be talking as much about our vision, our desires, as we will be talking about the relative well-being and best interest of our customers or clientele as we move forward. And so what we're about to do is move into the world of moral intuitions. One way to kind of understand this language is that there's an entire field that has begun to sort of understand the relationship between the emotions and our rational well-being, our rational capacities. And frankly, what the research tells us is our emotions respond first, and then our rational thoughts tend to follow. So if you were to read about the limbic system, for instance, and this work was made famous by Joseph Ledoux in a book he later wrote called The Synaptic Self, where when we see, say, a snake, if you're walking around in the neighborhood and all of a sudden you hear a rattle or you look down, you just see a snake, we're going to react, we're going to respond to that even before we register in our front prefrontal cortex that is a snake and that we need to move. We jump. We don't wait until the prefrontal cortex sort of decides, is that a harmful snake? Is that a non-threatening snake? All that kind of stuff. We're not just sitting there thinking about genus, type, species. No, we just go snake, jump. If it would be probably 20 feet in the air, and then after we land, we go, well, that was silly, or thank you, Jesus, one or the other. So our limbic system moves faster than our prefrontal cortex. Just the synapses fire faster. Excuse me. And then what happens is we sometimes then rationalize that action after the fact, which I always think is funny when that happens, but it's natural. It is human that it works that way. And the low road, the limbic system, the emotional system often regulates even what the high road is going to do before it's all said and done. And so in a way, intuitions, if you think of those as sort of those emotional responses that start to happen, are really sometimes also around whether or not something is good or bad, happens at a kind of gut level, low road kind of response. We really begin to get a sense that we are responding emotionally based on our sense of whether something is good or bad at that low road level before we sometimes are rationally deciding whether it's good or bad. Now, a lot of this basically is through the work of moral psychology, but it really did surface first with positive psychology. But sometimes then that just means that not only does that help us, well, let me say it this way. Positive psychology was a kind of form of psychology that emerged that basically looked at a lot of the theory and insights that psychologists had about people and their dysfunction and how to help them become more functioning. In other words, to go from ill to well, and began to say, but isn't there other insights in psychology that could help us move from well to better? That actually can make us better persons, not just stable persons or functioning persons. And when you add that to the discussion, and not only does it make us better, but how does that help us then live a good life? Then suddenly there was this idea that, maybe our intuitions are working toward at least our assumptions about the good life in such a way that is guiding a lot of our responses right along our rational, whether or not it's beneficial for me from a rational standpoint. This is actually even true through the work of philosophers like, Aristotle, and sort of the idea of how virtues and vices language functions in everyday life, how it affects us, but also even Adam Smith. For all of his Wealth of Nations, which was actually his second major work, and actually it was a social psychology of trying to make sense of how is it that times people seem to act greedy. It seems to help everybody, and that's kind of how he was actually a moral theologian, if you want to think about it that way, or moral psychologist, some people would argue, or a moral philosopher. And the reason for that is because his first book is A Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in that book, one of the classic lines that in that book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, that he says right at the very beginning of the book, he says, however selfish man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, not rational self-interest, but in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to this selfish man or woman, though they derive nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. So, I mean, right from the beginning of Smith's first book is, when I look out, I watch people acting in very benevolent ways, and it's got nothing to do with rational self-interest. They just seem to do it even though they don't seem to take any specific pleasure out of it. It's that Adam Smith that's often overlooked that I want to kind of bring back into the conversation, particularly around this idea, not just fear-based reaction, but this kind of proclivity toward a moral intuition toward the good, whatever that means, and how that might impact how your pitch or your later marketing might have a difference. So where are you going with all of that theory up to this point? Well, stay with me. It's not a long presentation, but we'll get there. Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. It's an intriguing book because basically he did a lot of social science research through a website where people took questionnaires, and Haidt is a very good social psychologist researcher, and his observations were that ultimately most people posture their lives from a moral standpoint out of one of sort of 5 different postures. Now, these are not just one and then the other 4 don't count, but we tend to privilege some and not others. And I was wondering why it was that, seemingly good people could be so radically divisive over politics. And he was trying to solve that problem and religion. Some of his answers to that I don't fully agree with. His diagnosis I really like. Sort of the rationale behind it is really anchored in a kind of social psychology I don't always agree with, but it's a fascinating read. It's worth the read if you have time for it. But basically, he says that people respond, so think again, sort of intuitively, at the very beginning, even as you're talking about your pitch, and your pitch carrying not only a value that you're communicating, but also your vision, your personal values sort of wrapped up inside that. People are going to be hearing it through the lens of either care or harm. In other words, that the good is how much care you can provide, or at least how much harm you can avoid. Or they might be hearing it, intuiting it through the language of justice or fairness versus cheating. So is this something that you are trying to be just and fair about, or again, pejoratively, or might they feel like they're being cheated out of however it's being portrayed? Are they hearing it through the language of loyalty or that of betrayal, particularly around their understanding of their tribe, their community, whether it's that church, if you're working within a ministry setting, or that community, if you think about the town, or their neighborhood? It's really kind of where the loyalty lies. Whether they're doing it, listening for the good through a sense of authority or subversion. In other words, this is providing a stable order, and we need to respect authority. More importantly, we can't just subvert people and the structures around us, or through a sense of sanctity or degradation, which is really focused more on purpose, whether it has a good, true, pure purpose, or whether it has a mixed purpose and goal. By the way, he also, in one of his books, raised the question whether or not liberty and oppression might also be one. I'll come back to that in a minute. But these first 5, basically what Haidt is saying is that people already begin to form a moral opinion before they think of a rational adjudication decision around what you're talking about. And often it is the language that you would use that sometimes creates mixed messages. So let's just talk about one out of the last 5 years that is just a great example of this inside the church. So you might have people talking about Black Lives Matter who are often talking about, well, we need to do this because we need to restore justice to African American people. We need to treat them fairly. We need to make this happen. And for them, that's all they can talk about and think about. While the person right across the pew from them are talking about, well, we need to back the blue because we need to show respect for authority, and we need to basically make sure that these people aren't subverting our good society and tearing it down. And so that's what's more important. Or another example, so this one with Colin Kaepernick and taking the knee, where it was really about a question of justice and fairness for people that were being basically abused by police or those there, or if it was a disrespect of the authority represented in the flag. And I hope you hear how you probably observed this, why people could no longer even have a rational conversation with each other, because at that moral level, they were so intuitively locked into one of these intuition postures, if you will, that many times they were just sort of talking past each other emotionally while they might be having what they thought were very rational arguments simultaneously. So Haidt is only using this. Basically, he says people who tend to be liberal, that'd be his way of saying it, really focus more on the care and justice side. People who tend to be conservative, and what I would say here is conserving, tend to focus on loyalty and authority and sanctity. It's really more about the protection of the boundaries and conserving those boundaries. And, this has just been a part of why Haidt would say people have difficulty talking to each other and respecting each other. So what about liberty and oppression? Well, funny thing is he actually did identify a whole set of people who were self-identified libertarians. And every time he did these studies, he would also then compare it to a whole set of other categories of things like fairness and authority and sanctity. I mean, those kinds of questions were being asked alongside basically that the most important thing is freedom or not. And what he found was people who stressed freedom as the ultimate goal didn't even score significantly at all in any of the other categories. And so he was at a conundrum. Basically, the libertarian view doesn't seem to have any kind of moral orientation other than someone feeling that they're free to do what they want to do. I think theologically we might understand that in a slightly different way, but at least it helps understand why Haidt, though he gestures at liberty on a couple of occasions, he tends to hold it off because he's not quite sure whether it has enough moral content inside that posture, particularly alone, to even stack up with the other five. And I hope you hear the whole idea here is that people will react based on the moral intuition that shapes them deeply. I mean, what they think is the most virtuous world. So is the most virtuous person the person who's just, or is it the person who actually is the one who is loyal? Is the virtuous person the person who is caring, or is it the one who basically commands authority? You can almost think about different sermon series, for instance, and whether it falls on the issue of respect, is it respect for authority, or the issue of care. And ultimately how these virtues are being kind of curated within people's lives. Not I don't mean this evilly at all. I mean, it's just natural. Definitely the one around sanctity, if you think about purity and how that language is how often operated. Then the worst thing is it's something where you feel like you're degrading, making something, degrading something as a result of an action or a behavior. And that really can create problems. So, for instance, and this is just an example I use. So, Casey Family Services seeks to overcome the injustices of racial disparity by supporting families of color to obtain services often denied them in our community. Under the justice fairness category, that would probably be a great pitch. But as you're reading that and hearing that through the language of some of these other categories like authority or loyalty, you can now begin to understand why somebody actually could say that and somebody else go, what do you mean? Are you saying that I'm, not only that I'm unjust, I mean, that's already something that's implied that I cheat, that I'm a cheater, and with which you go, no, racism is systemic. I mean, you could make a lot of different kind of arguments, but they're already hearing it in a different kind of frame. Or that, are you going to allow, are you going to allow these people to get services that are going to, in some ways, break down the authority of the community, and or are you going to at least make them have to work for it so that they reach the same standards and that they demonstrate the same loyalty to this community? So I got to kick into this community. It's not surprising. People might not even say that to you, but if you are working out of one category in your pitch, and it comes with your values, maybe you really feel strongly about the theme of justice, and I would understand that. Understand why other people might just feel ill at ease, even responding to this kind of a pitch statement in the way in which it's framed and talked about. So, is there another way moving forward? Well, one way to think about it is through the language of basically virtue psychology or moral psychology. And one thing that the research in moral psychology has taught us is that most of the virtues normally start by first helping people see what's going on, or recollect something in their own life that's consistent with what's going on. That then evokes a moral intuition, a desire, if you will, that's somewhat connected to the very thing they're observing. That then brings them to helping them see even a deeper virtue underneath it, sort of feel it at the core of their being. And that's where you're actually deepening their own sort of engagement, their own intuitive engagement into the virtue in such a way that they feel it deeply. And then they apply it in everyday life. They begin to see how it makes application in everyday life. So let's go back and let's drop the justice language for a minute. Now, even as I say that, I hope you hear I'm thinking about it in a way that basically communicates the same thing I want this family services to do, but to do it in a way that can be heard better. And so I go, what if I talk about it not through the language of justice, or at least not justice alone, but talk through the language of care and harm. So let's start with that as the moral intuition. And so basically, Casey Family Services reaches into the struggles of daily parenting of everyday people of color. Now, in doing that, I help them see something that the people themselves probably can recognize. I mean, most people that are hearing this probably have, if they've not been parents, they've been children. So they understand that everyday parenting challenge. And even using the language everyday people is just reminding this is not a special class alone. This is what we all experience. So you're tapping into that recollection of their own experiences where families struggle to care for their children. So it reaches into the struggle of daily parenting of everyday people where those people struggle to care for their children. And already now you're tapping into that moral intuition of wanting to provide that care. So we come alongside kids by breaking down the barriers that prevent them from receiving our best possible care. Now, that's a virtue. In other words, we are helping them receive the best possible care, the highest care we can offer. And how do we do that? Through connecting families to services that assist in every area of life. And so how do we do that? How can they actually apply it? Well, by becoming part of those connections with families to services that assist in everyday life. Now, in a way, if you look at the previous slide, where we overcome injustice of racial disparity by supporting families of color to obtain services, often denied them in our community. So it implies that we deny them. So I hope you hear how that language communicates versus, well, we're just entering into the everyday struggle of parents where really the care for these children is such a struggle for people of color, so that we can come alongside those kids, all of us, and break down those barriers that prevent them from receiving our best possible care. Yeah, it is our community. These are our children. They need to be a part of our community. And so we're going to connect families to those services, the system, in everyday area of life. Does that accomplish the same value of wanting to see the best that's going on in these families and children? Does that connect to a vision of a better world for all people, and particularly? It could. Is it a kind of way of connecting to the intuitive value that these people see through the language of care as opposed to the language of justice? It is merely a way of thinking about, okay, how do I break down my pitch in such a way that I'm speaking at the heart of people in a way that really helps them connect their own intuitive moral disposition, show them the virtue, and help them find a way to participate. Just an example. Kind of thing to think about as you're thinking about your pitch as you go forward is to think about these moral intuitions. I mean, either embedded within your own personal values, as because you know they're going to show up, but also in the kind of value statement of what the ministry or the service or the venture is going to offer. Are you talking through this language of either care or justice or loyalty or authority or sanctity? And more importantly, even how you talk about it, how would it be heard through the language of harm or cheating or betrayal, or subversion or degradation? You might not be able to control for all that. You need to be upfront. I mean, I need to be upfront. Say you can't. But as they ask questions back to you, are they all basically talking through a different moral intuition? One way to think about this, without stealing language that's pretty famous with Gary Chapman and his writing, is there's a different kind of love language that you want to sometimes communicate, a moral good that you want to communicate. And are you communicating that in such a way that it is consistent with your own vision and does help communicate the value of the venture that you're going to offer? Now, I want you to recognize that asking the question, where is the heart of your pitch, is something that is relational and alongside the ideological, the important components as well. I don't want you ever to think about this for the sake of manipulating someone. That is not the goal. But it can help you anticipate the responses and sometimes even check your own motivation. I'm not opposed to justice. I think that is a key concern in our world today. So don't misunderstand that I'm opposed to one of these approaches. But I do think we have to recognize that when we use language sometimes, if we don't at least add to it some of these other languages, particularly care, that's an easy one to think about, but maybe even sanctity to help preserve the family. I mean, that'd be one way to think about how the sanctity would work. So that is, we're caring for all of our children, but we're also here to preserve the families so they don't have to be broken down, they don't degrade, is also important to think about. Now, I also want you to hear that as you're talking to people about your venture, you also have to think about the people that you are talking about. So for people of color in those communities, can they resonate with the language of care? But if you use language like sanctity, well, we're here to make sure those families don't have to be broken apart. I hope you hear that for people of color, they may hear that through the language of justice. They might look at you going, well, we appreciate you being here, but we're not the ones breaking our families apart. It's the unjust systems that are forcing our families to get broken apart. Sometimes that has been a problem. So recognize again that that kind of a response can also happen when you're talking on behalf of people, as well as you're talking to people about what your venture is trying to accomplish. Just as I close, remember that as you think about your pitch, how is it that you are anticipating how people might react, not merely on intellectual agreement, rational best interest, as Smith would say, but they're going to react based on the moral intuitions that have shaped them and are going to be a part of the conversation going forward. If you pause to at least consider that, I think it makes for a better pitch, but it also helps you then to listen to the responses so that over time your venture can be even more faithful as well as effective in ministry. So hope this has helped, and blessings to everyone, and we will see you again online. Take care.